Good evening. My name is Hei. The topic that I'm going to present is high degree of similarity between Bai and Caijia. Bai is spoken in the center of northern Yunnan. Naxi, the purple area, is to the north of Bai, and Lisu, the light purple area, is to the west of Bai. Yi is scattered around Yunnan, is used to be the dominant language in the province for a very long time, until around 400 to 500 years ago. Southwestern Mandarin has been the dominant language in the province since then. Bai is spoken by approximately 1.3 million people out of roughly 1.9 million people, so it's around 2/3 of the ethnic population. Wang Feng suggested that Bai can be divided into two branches, Eastern Bai and Western Bai. The prestigious dialect, Jianchuan dialect, belongs to Eastern Bai. Generally speaking, Eastern Bai is better documented than Western Bai. There are multiple hypotheses regarding the classification of Bai. The first one is the Montgomery hypothesis. I think no scholar supports this hypothesis in recent decades. Other hypotheses include the Creole hypothesis, the Tibeto-Burman hypothesis, the Sinitic hypothesis, and the Sino-Bai hypothesis. Similar to many languages in southwestern China, Bai has absorbed numerous words from southwestern Mandarin, but it's also noteworthy that a significant portion of its words, including basic words, are of Chinese origin but not borrowed from Mandarin. Next, Saija language. This language is spoken by approximately 500 to 1,000 people in northwestern Guizhou. It's a severely endangered language. Most fluent speakers of it are old people, but it doesn't mean all old people can speak it fluently. Actually, even among the elderly, many are not fluent in Caijia, like the wife of my informant. She only speaks a little bit of Caijia. Because of this, most fluent speakers of Caijia are forced to speak Southwestern Mandarin most of the time. Caijia was first documented by the Guizhou provincial government in 1982. Their report includes our grammar sketch and a short word list. Zheng Zhang proposed that Caijia, or the early form of Caijia, was introduced to Guizhou by Han immigrants around 300 BC. I don't find his claim particularly compelling, but as this is not the focus of my presentation, I'm not going to discuss it in detail. Perhaps Caijia was indeed brought to Guizhou by Han people, but probably not that early. There is evidence which demonstrates that Caijia branched off from mainstream Chinese early on. While Bai and Caijia are not adjacent to each other geographically, they appear to be closely related. The grammars of Bai and Caijia are highly similar. The canonical word order of them is SVO, whereas the canonical word order of Yi, Naxi, and Lisu is SOV. As many of you may know, the dominant main word order in Tibeto-Burman languages is SOV. Secondly, most attributive adjectives precede the noun in Bai and Caijia, as opposed to the reversed order in Yi, Naxi, Lisu, and Hemang. Overall, the grammars of Caijia, Bai, Chinese, Yi, Hema are not vastly different from each other. All of them are rather analytic. The grammars of Bai and Caijia are relatively more similar to that of Chinese. For example, the canonical word order of Chinese is SVO, and most attributive adjectives do precede the noun in Chinese. However, Bai and Caijia do differ from Chinese in some ways. For example, the classifier or numeral plus classifier phrase is placed after the noun. In the following example, the words in the phrase are in the order of chicken, 3, and the classifier. We know that in Semitic, classifier or numeral plus classifier phrase precedes the noun. Like in Mandarin, this phrase is 三只鸡, which means 3 plus classifier plus chicken. In Yi, the noun precedes classifier or numeral plus classifier phrase. So Bai and Caijia might have been influenced by Yi in this regard. Many of the similarities between Bai and Caijia lie in their added Sinitic layers. As I said, Bai and Caijia, along with many languages spoken in southwestern China, have absorbed many loanwords from southwestern Mandarin in recent centuries. But Bai and Caijia also have an early Sinitic layer. The first feature is related to Chisheng characters or departing tone characters. In recent Old Chinese reconstructions, the source of Middle Chinese Chisheng is said to be s ending. Starostin found out that several Chisheng characters in Bai behave as if they were Yusheng characters or entering tone characters, which means they seem to have had a plosive coda in the past. Before I talk about those special Chisheng characters, let's look at Starostin's analysis of main tonal correspondences between Bai and Middle Chinese first. The horizontal axis is for onset type in Middle Chinese, and the vertical axis is for Middle Chinese tone. So for characters which had a departing tone in Middle Chinese and whose onset is a voiceless obstruent onset in Middle Chinese, these characters are pronounced in 4-2 in Bai most of the time. But look at these special Chisheng characters. The first column includes characters with a voiceless obstruent onset in Middle Chinese, and the second column includes characters with a voiced obstruent onset in Middle Chinese. The third one includes those with a voiced sonorant onset in Middle Chinese. As they are Chisheng characters, normally we expect their tones to be 4-2, 3-1, 4-2, or 3-1 respectively. But in reality, their tones are 4-4, 4-2, and 4-4 respectively, which behave like Yusheng characters or entering tone characters. Wang Feng suggested that the tonal patterns of Chisheng characters in Bai Among other arguments, like written Tibetan pronunciation and Sino-Xenic pronunciations, reveal that there were two sources for Chushan characters. The characters I mentioned in the previous slide was with S ending according to him, and other Chushan characters like the ones for chopsticks, tree, vegetables, land, are the ones which didn't have S ending in Old Chinese. In other words, he disagrees with reconstructing S ending in Old Chinese for all Chushan characters. I propose that Bai's case does not necessarily refute the S theory. If you look at the special Chushan characters in the left-hand column, you will see that 8 out of 10 of them had TS ending in Old Chinese. So the pronunciation next to the character is the Old Chinese reconstructed pronunciation. So as I said, you see 8 out of 10 of them end with TS, whereas all characters in the right-hand column, which are other Chushan characters found in Bai, do not end in TS. So there is a possibility that TS changed to T in earlier stages of Bai, which explains why these special Chushan characters behave like entering tone characters. How about the case in Caijia? In Caijia, the Yin Chushan characters are comparable to Bai's case. The 3 characters in red are found in the special Chushan group I mentioned earlier, and their tone is 2-1 in Caijia. Meanwhile, none of these characters in tone 2-2 or 3-3 belong to that group. So Bai's case and Caijia's case are obviously related. However, the tone context is different. Tone 2-1 in Caijia mostly corresponds to Yang Pingsheng in Middle Chinese. So the exact development pathway from Old Chinese to Caijia is unclear. Next, let's talk about the velar fricative reflex for some R characters. Old Chinese R developed into L in Middle Chinese, but in Bai and Caijia, the reflex of R is sometimes velar fricative R. You can see the examples in the lower part of the table. The velar fricative is unlikely to be derived from L because this fricative is seldom an allophone of L. But what caused Old Chinese R to have 2 types of reflexes in Bai and Caijia? I think it's not very clear yet. As you can see, the upper group contains only non-pharyngalized R characters, but the second group contains both pharyngalized and non-pharyngalized R characters. So I don't think there is a very clear conditioning environment. The exact development pathway of R to velar fricative is not clear yet, especially when the intermediate stages between Old Chinese and Bai and Caijia were not attested. Next, the word wind. Its Middle Chinese pronunciation ends with a velar nasal. Most characters ending with a velar nasal in Middle Chinese go back to the same coda in Old Chinese, but this character does not. In Shi Jing, or classic of poetry, this character rhymes with characters whose Middle Chinese pronunciations end in M. So naturally, the coda of this character, wind, also ends in M in Old Chinese. But as early as the Han Dynasty, there are examples where this character rhymes with other NG characters in poetic expositions. In Shimi, a book written in late 2nd century AD, dialectal pronunciations were mentioned for certain entries. Two of them are sky and wind. When illustrating the meaning of wind, the author stated that wind is pronounced with broadened mouth shape and closed lips in Yanzhou, Yuzhou, and Sizhou, similar to how fan is pronounced there. In Qingzhou and Xuzhou, roughly eastern part of northern China, it is pronounced with contracted mouth, open lips, and forceful aspiration, similar to how fang is pronounced. So we can infer that the coda of this character became NG or velar nasal in Eastern dialect in the Eastern Han Dynasty. This change is reflected in Middle Chinese. As you can see, the ending of it is NG. It joined other own characters or Dongyun characters. In virtually all Sinitic languages, wind behaves like other own characters or Dongyun characters. Gongxun suggested that Bai is seemingly related to the Western dialect in Eastern Han Dynasty in this respect. You can look at the first 4 characters in the table. They have the same rhyme in Middle Chinese, but they don't share the same rhyme or vowel in Bai. The vowel of wind in Bai is E, and the vowel of the other 3 characters is nasal vowel V. So they have different rhyme or vowel reflexes. How about the case in Caijia? Middle Chinese on or Dongyun corresponds to on in Caijia. If the onset is a bilabial onset, then the final is with a schwa instead. So in case Caijia descends from Middle Chinese, we would expect its rhyme to be with a schwa, but in reality, the character is pronounced as bang. In fact, Old Chinese rhyme like other rhymes ending in M in Old Chinese, developed into in Caijia.
I have about 3 minutes left.
Oh, 3 minutes. Okay, thank you. This is the next point of this part. Many shared Sinitic roots between Bai and Caijia are rarely found in other Sinitic languages or only used in compound nouns and idioms in those languages. The first example is Bi. It means short and low in Bai and Caijia. Is obsolete in other Sinitic languages. Is not even used in idioms or proverbs. The second example is Ju. It means to seed in Bai and Caijia. It can also mean to reside in Bai. It's only used in some formal compound nouns in other Sinitic languages like Mandarin, Cantonese, Wu, and so on. In historical texts, this character means to squat or to sit with legs spread. The third character is Mo. It means pot in Bai and Caijia. It's obsolete in other Sinitic languages. Characters like Guo or Bao are used instead in Mandarin, Cantonese, Wu, etc. The last example is Fu. If we really have to pronounce it in Mandarin, it's Fu, but this Qisheng reading is actually obsolete in Mandarin, as well as in other Sinitic languages. It means lid in Bai and Caijia. This is the last part of my presentation. The shared words between Bai and Caijia, which are etymologically unclear. So these 9 pairs of Bai and Caijia words are likely cognates, but are probably not of Chinese origin. At the same time, they don't seem to be borrowed from Nisu or Hmong either. More works have to be done to clarify their etymology. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you, everyone. Sorry for the problems in the beginning of my presentation.
Thank you, Lee. It's a great presentation. Any questions are welcome. So can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So the minority language in I remember it's in Yunnan, right?
Yes, correct.
So do you know how many minority languages are there in Yunnan?
Well, I think I would say there are at least 20 minority languages there.
Okay. It seems I remember you mentioned that the Thai, very bad memory, sorry about that. The Thai is the main dialect in Yunnan, right? Yi, or which one is that?
Yi, it used to be the dominant language in Yunnan.
Oh.
Prior to, I think around 1600.
1600.
Yeah.
Okay.
Prior to that, yeah.
So another language that you mentioned, it's endangered, right? Do you know how many people are speaking that language? It's Caijia, right? Caijia is endangering, right?
Yeah. As I said, I think there are roughly 500 to 1,000. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Do you know when did the language start kind of like dropping? Like the number of people are speaking that language are starting to drop in the history?
You mean now or in the past?
In the past. So
you mean?
Yeah.
Sorry. Please continue.
Yeah, it seems to me that it was spoken by maybe more than 500 or 1,000 in the past, right? So is it also a dominant language in Yunnan as well, or in the past? I mean.
Well, based on the historical texts, I don't think it has been the dominant language in Guizhou or Yunnan in the past, because it has never been spoken by a very large number of people. Yeah.
I think your finding is very interesting.
Okay.
Thank you.
I see that there are some questions.
Oh, yeah.
Why the comparison between these two languages? If they... Oh, yeah. Well, regarding to the first question, well, I think first of all, they are not really adjacent to each other. In the map that I showed you, they are roughly like 300 to 400 kilometers away from each other. I don't consider that very close. So if they demonstrate some similarities, I think is quite intriguing. As for the second question, if they're in the same area, they bound to be typologically and etymologically similar. Well,
I have the motivation behind this question because I saw your map and it to me it looks relatively close because I mean, you know, here in the US, like, you know, 800 miles is still the state of Texas, right? So like this is still, you know, the language or whatever, there's some like minor differences, but they do kind of like absorb one another while being, you know, also they're both like mutually intelligible, right? So, you know, I'm looking at the comparisons that you have here and I'm like, well, you know, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is like, well, yes, this makes sense, like, you know, especially the comparisons of the examples that you had. So that's why I was kind of curious why these two in particular.
Okay, thank you for your question. First, I think okay, I will answer your question later. Thank you. Okay. First, I think English in the United States is a very different situation because we all know that English or other Indo-European languages have only been spoken in the Americas for like 400 to 500 years. So naturally, we would expect there to be fewer diversity and regional differences. But in the case of Yunnan, those languages have existed there for quite a long period of time. So if these languages demonstrate similarities, I think it must represent that they are somehow related, like they must have particularly close contact in the past. And most of the content I presented is about their Sinitic layers. The Sinitic layers of them are related, but they are not found in other languages in southwestern China, because even Yi or Nazi might have contact with Chinese in the past. They don't have such a big Sinitic layer with so many Sinitic words. So I think it's why I want to compare them. Thank you for your question. And how about yeah. Miss Wang. Miss Wang.
I want to ask you a question that is, did you compare Caijia and other dialects of Bai language? You know, there are 3 dialects of Bai language in Yunnan. There are Dali dialect and Nujiang and Jianchuan. So you compare the Caijia and the Jianchuan dialect, but how about Caijia and the Dali dialect and Nujiang dialect? Did you compare?
I also kind of compared the Dali dialect and Taijia. As for the Nujiang dialect, I think I also compared it with Taijia, but I didn't do it very extensively. Maybe I will work on it in the future.
Actually, I think you mentioned 风 风 in Chinese or in
Yes.
Bai language. Actually, in my opinion, 风 maybe is Sanskrit loanwords from India. As you know, in Bai language, in Austroasiatic language, and in Dagdai language, both of the words about feng can connect it with each other. For example, in Dagdai language, that is lam, and in Austroasiatic language, that is pum or plum. All these also in Chinese feng, also in Chinese feng, and also in Dali dialect of Bai language also feng. I think they can connect it with each other with Sanskrit parampi. Sanskrit that means wind. That means wind. So I don't think feng is a typical example in your comparison. In your comparison, maybe you can find another one.
Well, I
More
think
better.
it is insightful, but in the case of Caijia, I think this explanation is not very strong because, as I said, Caijia is spoken in Guizhou, which doesn't seem to have had very close contact with Sanskrit in the past. So, well, okay.
But
please.
but I think in ancient China, maybe this word has been borrowed from Sanskrit to China in very in very ancient China. Can I speak in Chinese? Can you understand Chinese?
Okay.
我想说，就是这个风，我觉得是在很古以前就已经介入到中国，然后，这个蔡家和这个白语呢，实际上是应该是在后面汉语发生之后才发生这个，所以我觉得他们应该都是从梵语来的这个词，我只说这个风这个词。可能都是从梵语来的，因为不管是从藏缅语。还是从南亚语，还是从这个侗台语，这个风都是联系非常密切的联系非常密切的。他们可以，我觉得他们可以算同源，但是这个同源是非常奇妙的，就是说它是从我觉得他们是从这个梵语的风来的就是既可以变成plume，也可以变成 lam，就是汉语的蓝风，你知道的吧？对吧？蓝风，蓝风跟这个风都是风，然后南亚语也好，侗台语也好，都是可以，就是基本上都是从这个梵语词都可以演变过来的。所以我觉得它应该是很早以前就来到这个是就是说我们说东亚地区，然后这个，所以我觉得你比较这个词的话，就是稍微有点不典型，因为它涉及的语言太多了。所以你说蔡家和这个白语的相同之处呢，我就觉得不够让我幸福，是这样子的。对不起，不好意思，你听懂吗
？Okay. I will look at the pronunciations in those languages to see if this claim is valid. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Then we have a very interesting debate, discussion. I think you two may also change email or maybe contact information to maybe discuss that question in further detail, perhaps. So thank you for coming to this section, and I wish you a good night. It seems like
we still have the social hour that's going on right now in room 4.
Okay.
So
room 4, right?
Hopefully everyone can make it to that.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation.
Oh, you're welcome. Goodbye.